In the 1500s, Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa realized that a narrow strip of land separated the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, and it could be dug to connect these two. Subsequently, King Charles I of Spain tapped his regional governor to survey a route along the Chagres River in Panama. Such a route would need to run through mountainous and tropical terrain, and hence was deemed impossible. Impossible, but the idea of a canal connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans remained open. After all, it would create a shortcut between Europe and Eastern Asia. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at the history, the challenges, and the achievements surrounding the creation of the Panama Canal. The French were the first to initiate the task of creation of the Panama Canal after Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps successfully led the building of the Suez Canal in Egypt. So in 1880, the French team, led once again by Ferdinand de Lesseps, broke ground for a sea-level canal in the region. Very soon, though, the French realized the monumental challenge that lay ahead of them. Besides the mountainous terrain, the region was subject to incessant rains that caused heavy mudslides. And the heavy rains also led to the spread of yellow fever and malaria, resulting in a lot of fatalities. And very late in the project, de Lesseps realized that a sea-level canal was too difficult, and the focus needed to move towards a lock canal. But before he could shift focus to a lock canal, the funding was pulled from the project in 1888. So what's a lock canal? Well, contrary to the Suez Canal, which was dug through plains, the Panama Canal needed to pass through a very mountainous terrain, which was never at a consistent elevation. This meant you could either spend a lot of resources and money to dig all the way to the sea level, or you could have a series of chambers and gates to raise or lower the ships by controlling the water level within this terrain. Ferdinand de Lesseps and the other engineers chose the latter option, and these series of chambers and gates to raise or lower ships by controlling the water level are called locks. Hence the term lock canal. So when the funding was pulled from Ferdinand de Lesseps, the United States in around 1900 evinced interest in building the canal. But initially, there was a strong sentiment towards building a canal across Nicaragua because the terrain seemed to be less tricky than in Panama. But later it was realized that this relatively easier terrain had a string of active volcanoes all along its way. So in 1902, with the passage of the Spooner Act, US Congress authorized purchase of the French assets in the Panama Canal Zone for $40 million. So why was the US suddenly interested in constructing the Panama Canal? The reasons were both political and economic. Political because the US had just come out of the US-Spanish War, and it was gradually expanding its influence in the Pacific. On the Atlantic side, it had expanded its power over Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Caribbean. But on the Pacific side, it had gained control over the Philippines. And the Panama Canal was being looked upon as a very critical link between the US and the Philippines. And strategically, since at the time an air force didn't exist, having strategic control over the oceans was very critical. World power was consistent with maritime power, and the US knew that if they could move ships quickly between East and West, they could control the outcome of wars. And economically, the canal enabled world trade to become faster, since it was creating a commute route across the Americas. And that is why Wall Street was very supportive and helped with the funding. So Panama is the preferred location, and the canal is going to be built as a lock canal. But there was another problem. Panama at that time was ruled by Colombia. And when the United States approached Colombia, the proposal to build a canal across Panama was rejected by the Colombian Senate. Now, Panamanians at that time wanted independence from Colombia. And the United States seized this opportunity and supported a Panamanian revolt against Colombia. And subsequently, Panama declared its independence from Colombia in November of 1903. The Colombians were not going to sit back and let the Panamanians declare independence. So they sent their forces to suppress the revolt. But the US Navy intervened and prevented the Colombians from entering Panama. Panamanian independence was final. On November 18, 1903, the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty was signed between the United States and Panama, granting the United States exclusive and permanent possession of the Panama Canal Zone. The treaty was negotiated by U.S. Secretary of State John Hay and French engineer Philippe Jean Bunau-Varilla. But no Panamanians were part of this treaty, and that became a major cause of resentment of the Panamanians against the United States. Essentially, Panama had gained independence, but lost its sovereignty. With its new ownership of the Canal Zone, the United States formally kicked off the Panama Canal construction project via a dedication ceremony on May 4, 1904, with Chief Engineer John Wallace. The construction of the Panama Canal by the United States can be divided across 3 distinct periods, each corresponding to the tenure of the chief engineer. So we start in May of 1904, when John Wallace was appointed chief engineer. John Wallace began his career as an assistant civil engineer for the U.S. Engineering Corps, and part of his experience included river and harbor work on the upper Mississippi. But even though the French had left with a strong recommendation for a lock canal, the U.S. engineering team ignored that and started with the objective of building a sea-level canal. And that was the first observation that John Wallace had when he started work on the canal. The terrain would be a serious obstacle towards the construction of a sea-level canal. Wallace wanted to spend a little time surveying the area to get a better feel for the best approach towards engineering the canal, but he received strict orders from President Teddy Roosevelt that no delay would be allowed. The biggest problem that Wallace faced towards speeding up work on the canal was that the workers were dealing with a decade-old equipment left behind by the French. So the excavation was slow, and this was usually followed by flooding and landslides, which created additional setbacks, and these led to a damaged morale among the workers. So Wallace got rid of the old equipment left behind by the French and ordered a fresh set of tools and equipment from the United States. With the new equipment in place, the shoveling throughput increased dramatically, but the excavated dirt and spoil continued to pile up because the train infrastructure intended to remove the debris and spoils was unable to keep pace. So Wallace was forced to drop his throughput to 25% of the peak capacity of these machines. So Wallace's biggest bottleneck ended up being the infrastructure associated with the removal of spoils and debris. In the meantime, a 7-member presidential committee had been established to avoid the inefficiency and corruption that had plagued the French 15 years earlier. And this committee was known as the Isthmian Canal Commission, or the ICC. The ICC introduced a new process, but that ended up becoming a huge bureaucratic hurdle for Wallace. Every decision made by Wallace in the Canal Zone had to be approved by the ICC. So Wallace's engineers ended up filling out more than 1,000 work request forms on a weekly basis, which led to even the simplest of tasks slowing down. And to make matters worse, yellow fever and malaria started spreading among the workforce, impacting the overall productivity and creating a huge dent in the morale. Overwhelmed by these problems, John Wallace abruptly resigned in June of 1905. Subsequently, John Stevens was appointed chief engineer of the Panama Canal project based on his accomplishments at the Great Northern Railway. His key engineering accomplishment had been the expansion of the American rail lines westward, which had contributed to fresh settlements in the Pacific Northwest. Now, before jumping into the job, Stevens tried to understand all the issues that had happened in the past so he could root cause these and make sure the mistakes were acknowledged and not repeated. In modern terms, he conducted a project retrospective. Stevens acknowledged the challenge of cutting through hundreds of feet of mud and rock in the Culebra Mountain. And noticing how little progress his predecessors had made in excavating this area, he realized that the plan to build a sea-level canal was impossible. So Stevens came up with a new plan which consisted of locks, dams, and a new artificial lake, influenced partly by the French recommendation before they left. And he lobbied extensively with the ICC to get approval for this change in plan. Finally, after more than a year of construction, the United States approved the implementation of a lock canal. Stevens also understood the bottleneck that had been created by the railroad system. So he asked one of his engineering managers, Ralph Budd, to take on the difficult job of rebuilding the railroad across the Panamanian Isthmus. A railroad efficient enough to operate around the clock at maximum capacity so it could act like a conveyor belt for the excavated spoil. The lock canal and the highly efficient railway system were two highly impactful decisions of Chief Engineer John Stevens. However, the biggest contribution towards the success of the Panama Canal came from Chief Sanitation Officer Dr. William Gorgas. Stevens and Gorgas were appointed to the canal leadership team around the same time, and Gorgas's primary objective was the eradication of yellow fever and malaria across the nearly 500 square miles of dense Canal Zone jungle. Since the French time, yellow fever and malaria had been a full-raging epidemic in the Canal Zone and had led to thousands of fatalities. The primary issue was that the dirt from the excavation used to keep piling up, and when it rained, it would turn into puddles, which attracted mosquitoes, which in turn kicked off the epidemic. So Chief Engineer John Stevens' decision to build an efficient rail system to prevent the dirt from piling up helped a lot. But Dr. Gorgas implemented an extremely efficient sanitation system which ensured that both malaria and yellow fever were eradicated from the Canal Zone. Gorgas enlisted 4,000 workers to clean up mosquito breeding areas by draining swamps and spreading oil on the surface of standing water. They installed window screens and tight-fitting doors in living areas and fumigated living and working areas with pyrethrum insecticide and sulfur, along with establishing protocols for administration of anti-malaria medication. Within 2 years of establishing these intensive sanitation protocols, the two diseases were nearly eliminated. And it was at this point that the construction of the waterways and the locks within the Canal Zone started reaching peak productivity. And it is no surprise that William Gorgas is often deemed the hero of the Panama Canal, ahead of the achievements of Chief Engineer John Stevens and other engineers. But the credit for completion of the canal goes to John Stevens' successor, George Washington Goethals. In February of 1907, John Stevens suddenly resigned after a successful stint of only 20 months. Wait, he seemed to have made a lot of impactful decisions and led the canal towards operational efficiency. So, why did he suddenly resign? His resignation is still shrouded in mystery, but it is a big coincidence that he resigned within 2 months of President Teddy Roosevelt's visit to the Panama Canal. And it is likely that Roosevelt may have put further pressure on him to speed up the canal construction, and he likely resigned, frustrated at the never-ending pressure to speed up the construction despite all his achievements. So on February 26, 1907, Colonel George Washington Goethals was appointed the new chief engineer of the Panama Canal project. Goethals turned out to be a brilliant manager, and across his 7-year stint at the canal, he earned the title Genius of the Panama Canal. And Teddy Roosevelt himself felt that it was important to appoint a military man as the head of the Panama Canal project to introduce military rigor and discipline to get the canal to completion. Like Stevens, Goethals took some time to assess the current status of the project, understanding the successes and the challenges before introducing changes to speed up the process. At the time of Goethals joining, the Culebra Cut, which was the artificial valley that was intended to cut through the continental divide in Panama, was the most challenging project within the Canal Zone. Goethals realized quickly that it was not productive for one man to supervise the entire 10 miles of the Culebra Cut. So he subdivided the cut into 5 construction districts, each under the charge of a superintendent, and this immediately started showing better results. Goethals' decision-making and management was very much data-driven, and he had a knack for attention to detail. When he took over as chief engineer, there still were doubts about the feasibility of a log canal. So to put this issue to rest, Goethals had 5 test pits sunk to solid rock in which he could study the actual conditions that would be encountered. Once he and his team were satisfied, the issue was finally put to rest. And places where there were no outstanding issues, Goethals made sure that everybody was focused on making the dirt fly. That is, the excavation and shoveling was going on in full gear. And he was recording the metrics for performance measurement as well. By the August of 1907 rainy season, a record 1 million cubic yards a month of dirt shoveled had been established. The bar continued to be raised and met, and ultimately a target of 3 million cubic yards a month was established. And once this target continued to be met, Goethals focused on reducing the cost of achieving this target. In other words, cost optimization of the canal operations. Because of a lack of amusement in the canal vicinity, many workers used to get burnt, quit their jobs, and head home. Goethals took note of this issue early on and speeded up the building of several YMCA buildings which were intended to serve as clubhouses for the workers. The labor turnover immediately came down, and so did the liquor sales, which were the only source of entertainment for the workers before the YMCA clubhouses. A large majority of the laborers for the Panama Canal came from the West Indies, especially from the sugar-producing island of Barbados. Why? Because the prices of sugar had started coming down, impacting the economy of Barbados, so these workers were looking for jobs elsewhere. By 1907, the labor force comprised about 24,000 laborers, with more than 75% hailing from the West Indies. And the first American women in Panama were the nurses. The management of the labor force followed a very vast system of racial and ethnic segregation. Essentially, gold and silver roles. American white workers were paid in gold, and they had better housing conditions. Most of the workers of African descent from the Caribbean were on silver rolls and lived in hovels and ate outside or under porches during torrential rains. But there were also workers from other European countries, mainly Spain, and they were referred to as semi-white Europeans. And they were essentially excluded from the white hotels and cafeterias. And not happy with this treatment, a lot of the strikes within the Canal Zone originated from this group. By 1914, the system of locks to raise and lower ships between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans was complete. The locks were essentially raising ships on either side to 85 feet above sea level to the Gatun Lake before lowering them back to sea level to get to the other side. The Panama Canal officially opened on August 15, 1914, although the grand opening ceremony was downgraded due to the outbreak of World War I. The canal was completed at a cost of $350 million, which at the time was the most expensive construction project in US history. After the opening, the canal stayed under US administration, with the Canal Zone being considered US territory where Panamanians had restricted access. By the 1940s, the US realized that the canal did not bring much strategic value. Voices in the Department of Defense started calling for the US to reduce its involvement, with President Harry Truman calling for turning the canal over to the United Nations, with his famous quote, "Why don't we get out of Panama before we are kicked out?" So why the sudden loss in interest? The primary reason was the dieselization of the railroads and the interstate highway system. So for transporting goods from the East Coast to destinations in Asia, it was more economical to transport them to Seattle via the rail network or interstate highway system and then ship them from Seattle. So in September of 1977, the Panama Canal Treaties, also known as the Torrijos-Carter Treaties, were signed for the gradual transfer of control of the Panama Canal Zone back to Panama. This gradual transfer was completed on December 31, 1999, and since then, Panama has been managing the affairs of the canal. So what's the controversy about President Trump wanting the ownership back in US hands? The Panamanians have actually managed the canal incredibly well. They've expanded the canal, increased the services provided around the canal, which has made the canal a more valuable logistical point for global trade. And in the process, they've treated everybody fairly and equally, including the United States. So the issue is not that the United States is being unfairly treated. It's that it's not being preferentially treated. But all that should not undermine the marvelous and outstanding effort that the United States did from an engineering perspective towards building the Panama Canal. We'll end this section of the program with a quote from President Teddy Roosevelt, which is engraved in the rotunda of the administration building of the Panama Canal. "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause, who, at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat." On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Prior to the October 7 attack, when did Israel withdraw its military from Gaza? In line with the Oslo Accords, Israel conducted a unilateral withdrawal of all security forces and settlements from the Gaza Strip in August and September of 2005. So the answer is D, 2005. Question for the current episode. What percent of global trade passes through the Panama Canal? Is it A, 20%, B, 5%, C, 40%, or D, 50%? Once again, what percent of global trade passes through the Panama Canal? Is it A, 20%, B, 5%, C, 40%, or D, 50%? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We meet again in 2 weeks with another interesting and exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.